Today we will create this animation in Blender, which is free and open source. So after opening it up, I will quickly explain you the basics of Blender. This is your viewport and you can navigate by holding the middle mouse button down to rotate, or with holding the Shift key on your keyboard and dragging with the middle mouse button to move around. And you can zoom in and out with your mouse wheel. Let's add something to our scene. To do this, press Shift A, and now this menu shows up, and you can either use the search or use these little submenus to add, for example, a cube. Now I'm zoomed out a lot and our cube is this small, and we could either zoom in by using the mouse button, or when you are lost and you don't know where it is, for example you are somewhere far away, you can press the F key and Blender will automatically go to your selection. In 3D there are two different modes to view a 3D object. Right now we are in the orthographic mode. As you can see, we don't have a perspective in this. Our lines are always the same. If you measure this back line with this front line, it has the same length. To get into perspective mode, you can press 5 on your numpad. And now, as you can see, we're in a perspective mode. Most of the time I'm modeling in the perspective mode. You can also view the sides or the top by clicking up here on the axis or using your numpad. Let's do it here. For example, if I click on X, and now we are in the perspective mode, so press 5 to get into orthographic mode, and now we have a perfect side view of our cube. To go back, you can just rotate it again. To move an object, you can press G on your keyboard and move it around. Or if you want to move it along one axis, you can press G and then the axis, for example X on your keyboard, and move it along the X axis. If you are on this axis mode, you can also type in a number. For example, let's type 10 for 10, and it moves 10 increments along the X-axis. What if we want to rotate our model? For this, we can press R for rotate, and then we can also select the axis. So let's press Z, and now we can rotate it along the Z-axis. All we are doing now is in the object mode, so we are moving whole objects. But what we also can do is moving parts of our model and changing our model. We can do this by going up here and go to the edit mode. The same thing can be achieved by pressing the tab key on your keyboard. Now as you can see, there are these dots. These are called vertices. And you can select them and move them around just like in the object mode. This changes our model. You can also select multiple vertices by holding down Shift and selecting more of these. Then we can move them around. Or you can press S to scale, and now we are scaling them to be further apart. Let's go back to the object mode and delete our first cube, which isn't a cube anymore. You can do this by pressing the delete button or by pressing X and delete it. I want to create a city scene. So I will start by pressing Shift A, and we could do this with a cube, but a plane is enough for the ground. Select this plane, and now let's scale it up. After creating the plane, we will go on by creating our houses. To do this, I will create a basic cube. And now we can either use it as it is or scale it along one axis to make a bigger building. Maybe scale it up to make it even higher and move it up a little bit. What we also can do is go into the edit mode and change things about the model. For example, if I want to have a part which is sticking out here, I can use my mouse cursor over here and in the edit mode, press Ctrl R. Now you can see there's this yellow line around our cube. And by using the mouse wheel, we can increase the count of them. So let's create 2. If you click once, you can now move it along of the cube. And let's do it with a basic offset, for example, here. If you click again, it will be set here. Now I want to extrude this side. And we could either select all the vertices, and 2 of them are under our ground. So we could go down here and select them too with the Shift key and then extrude it. Or the better way would be to go up here and go into the face selection mode. If you're under face selection mode, you can just click any face and it selects all the vertices of this face. Now, let's select it and press E on your keyboard to extrude it. You can drag your mouse to make it bigger or smaller. And then with a left mouse button, you will make the change. Now our building looks like this. For a basic city scene with a lot of buildings, I think this is enough to create the illusion of a complex city. We don't need to model windows or any smaller details. So let's go ahead and model a few more of these. So that's what I did. And I arranged them in a city-like manner, and I created this spacing for a street. I kept them quite simple, and some of them I've copied to make a little grid. What I also did was adding a few round shapes like these. You can do this by pressing Shift A and adding a cylinder mesh. The next step would be to set up our lighting. For this, you can add a light, which you can do with Shift A, and then go down here, light, and select a sun. If the sun is down here, you can move it up by pressing GZ. You can see there are 2 parts, this part with the sun icon and this yellow part. And with this yellow part, you can decide from which direction the sun is shining. If you have a sun, it doesn't matter where the sun is in the world, it will always be the same lightning and only this direction matters. If you have another light source, the location of this light matters. But you will probably be asking, why can't I see any shadows? And that's because we are in a modeling view mode where it's more easy to see things. What you can do is, first of all, go to the render tab at the right here and make sure your render engine is Eevee. There's also Cycles, which is higher quality, but it needs more processing power from your PC. So let's stay in Eevee. What you also need to make sure is that ray tracing is enabled. And what I also recommend is enabling motion blur. This will be important for later on when we render our scene. If you check these settings, you can go up here and switch the mode to the right one, which is the rendered mode. And now you can already see a change. In my case, it will look a little bit different from yours because I have already added a material to our ground. I will show you how to do this in a second. First of all, let's take our sun and change the angle. So let's rotate it and make sure it hits from another angle, which looks more interesting with the shadows. I decided to go with this angle. Now let's add a light path which travels through the road. To do this, we press Shift A again to add an object to our scene, and then go to the Curve submenu and select the path. You could also do this with the Bezier curve, but I think it's the easiest to create beautiful paths with the Path tool. It is this line, and let's move it up first so we can better see it. To edit this path, we need to go to the Edit mode. And now you can see here are some vertices too. And let's go to the top view, Z, and let's move these vertices in a way that we create our path through this street. Right now I've moved the first vertex to the top, and you can see this black line is our path. Not this one, this is from our light, but this one. And Depending on the position of your vertices, the curve of our path changes. Right now I'm just selecting any vertice and then pressing G to move it. Let's make something like this. Now we can go back to the object mode. And you see this is our path. If I go to the orthographic view mode by tapping the 5 button on our numpad, you can see I've missed the road a little bit. So let's move it down and let's extend both ends a little bit further. So head back to the edit mode and grab it with G and move it a little bit more down the street. We can go back into our perspective mode, select the path, and by pressing G and Z we can move it down onto the street. Now let's add our glowing effect to our path. To do this, we will first need to create some kind of geometry, like a tubing for this path. So click on the Data tab of the path, make sure it's 3D, the fill mode to full, and down here for the bevel, use the depth slider to increase the thickness of our path. We could make this quite thick, like this, but I like to leave it at something like 0.04. This looks right. Another thing, if we deselect the path so we can have a better look at it, and if we zoom in, we can see it is hollow and it doesn't have a cap on the end. So select it and just click on this fill caps. Now let's give it a material. You still need to have this path selected and head to the material menu. Here you can click new. What we need to do is to go down here to emission and change the color to the emission color we want. In our case it's red. But as you can see, nothing has changed yet because we still need to define a strength for it. So use the slider to slightly increase it, and I will set this at a strength of 3. If you can't see it glowing yet, you probably haven't checked the ray tracing option in our render mode. For the ground, I've also created a material. If we click the ground, you can see principled BSDF. I just changed the base color a bit to a slight blue and increased the metallic to 1 and set the roughness to 0.4. That's all I did. Now we need to add a camera. We can also do this with Shift A. Go down to the camera and add it to the scene. Right now our camera is in the origin of the world, which is down here. So let's move it with G and C a bit up. And as you noticed, I didn't move it up straight, but to the back. And that's because we have selected local on top of here. You can change this to global. Now it will move on the world axis. And if we have it on local, it moves on the axis of the camera. This can be quite handy sometimes. But instead of moving the camera to a spot where we want it to have, we will move with the viewport to the spot. I want our animation to start right here. You can press Ctrl Alt 0 and the camera moves exactly to your location. If you want to adjust it, you can select a border and move it with G around. Remember, you can switch between local and global coordinates, but I think if you're in the camera view, it's better to use local coordinates. So this is our starting point. Now you can go down here and move this a little bit up. This is a timeline, just like in DaVinci Resolve. And we can set keyframes here. So let's move the cursor to the 0 if it isn't already there. And then with the camera selected, go to the Object Properties tab and keyframe the location. You don't need to keyframe the rotation because we will add another object to track the orientation of our camera. But before we will set the second point of our camera, let's animate our path. Select our path, go to the data property, and here you have factor start and end, and if you move the slider, our curve animates. So let's keyframe this. At the start, it's here. Press this icon to create a keyframe. Then go to frame, let's say 80. Move it down to 0. And in DaVinci, this creates automatically a keyframe, but here you will have to create another keyframe, like this. Now, you can play your animation to see if it's at the correct speed. And don't worry about the flickering. This will dissolve when we will render it. Just look at the motion. As I told you, we will create another object to change the orientation of our camera. So let's press Shift A, go to empty, and add a sphere to bind this to our moving path. With the empty selected, go to the objects property and change the parent to our path. Now you can see it's somewhere up here, and that's because it isn't bound to this value where our path is, but to the end. So let's go back to the path and animate this. And this path animation is controlled by this slider. So let's go to the 0 and change the evaluation time to 100. Then create a keyframe, move forward to the last frame, which is 80, and change the evaluation time to 0. And create another keyframe. Now this sphere follows our path. Now for our camera, to track the sphere, we will select our camera. We will go to Constraints, Add Object Constraint, Track to, and select our empty sphere. Now you can see this dotted blue line, which indicates that our camera follows the sphere. Now let's animate the second position of our camera. So move the cursor to the frame where you want the camera to be at the second location. Then change your location. I want this to be a top view, so I hit the Z axis. And now I will press Ctrl Alt 0 to set the camera to my location. As you can see, we have a problem. Our camera is still facing this empty object, so we can't have a complete top-down look. So what we will do is, first of all, set the keyframes to this location, like this. Go somewhere to the middle of your animation, maybe frame 35. And now set a keyframe to the influence of the track to constraint from our camera. Our camera is still selected and we head to this constraints menu. Add a keyframe, go a few frames further, maybe frame 40. Change the influence to 0 and add another keyframe. Now hit the 0 on your numpad to go into your camera view and check out how this looks. And in my case there's still this shake here, and that's because these keyframes are too close to each other. So just select one part of them, move them up, and the other part and move them a little bit to the back. And now this should look much smoother. There's one thing I still want to add, which is depth of field. To do this, with the camera selected, go to the camera menu and check depth of field. There are two things you need to do. First, focus on object, select our sphere, like this, and then decrease the f-stop to the blur amount you want. So I will do a quite heavy effect on this to about 0.3, so our buildings in the front are already blurry. To create our final animation, let's go to the render tab. You could now change the cycles if you want realistic renderings, or if you need fast renderings, stay with Eevee. Then go to the output tab, select your resolution and make sure to specify the end of your animation. Our animation stops at frame 90. So let's type in 90 for the end. Down here you need to select a folder for the output and change the file format to FFmpeg. Then you can go to the top here, click on render and render your animation.